Hi everyone, myself Dr. M. Lakshmi Prasad, working as an associate professor in the Department of Data Science in Institute of Aeronautical Engineering, Hyderabad. So in this video, I'm going to discuss about what are the questions that may arise in the chapter of primary, secondary, and administrative data. So the very first question is that, so what is a primary data? So it is the term that should be for the data that should be collected at source, and this is the type of information that is going to be obtained directly from the first-hand sources. So by means of surveys and observations, experimentation are not subjected to any processing or manipulation. So that one you can able to call it as a primary data. So the primary data is the term which is going to be used for the data collected at source, and this type of information is going to be obtained directly from the first-hand sources by means of surveys or through observations or through experimentation, are not subjected to any processing or manipulation, right? And what define administrative data is the second one. So administrative data is the data where the organizations are able to collect their operations. Suppose it may include the data for routine operations and is going to be frequently used to assess how well an organization is achieving its intended goals. Right. So the administrative is the data where the organization going to be collect their operations and like the data for routine operations, and frequently it is going to be assess how well the organization is going to be achieving its intended goals. And next one, so demonstrate the data cleaning and data screening process. So before going to see that, so wherever we are going to clean our data in our research process, so the data cleaning and data screening is the step. So where you can able to apply this directly onto the data entry, and you must not start your analysis unless doing it, right? So the data screening is the important one, so which is going to be very easy to make mistakes when entering the data, and some errors can mess up using on our analysis also. And it is also important to spend the time for checking the mistake initially rather than trying to repair the damage later. So try another person to check out the data. So because of these problems, so the data screening came in picture, right? So the data cleaning and screening is the very fundamental steps where we have to perform before going to start your analysis. So why this data screening become important means, so it is very easy to make mistakes when entering the data, and some errors can mess up your analysis, and it is important to spend the time for checking mistakes initially rather than trying to repair the damage later. So try 100% to check your data. And what is missing data actually? So the missing data comes from the data entry. So where you can able to detect it from the frequencies of the variable and sort your data according to the ascending and descending order. Then you got the idea of missing values and go back and try to fill it. Run our descriptive analysis again, right? So if the missing data comes from the data entry, so what you have to do is, so you can able to detect it from the frequencies of the variable, and we have to sort your the data based on ascending and descending order. Then you have to got the IDs of missing value and go back and try to fill it. Run your descriptive analysis again. So if the data entry comes from the respondent tellers, then the respondent was ambiguous or the respondent forgot to answer the question, right? So the data entry may also become, right? So this is also one of part of missing data. Suppose the respondent was unambiguous and not answering the questions what you're going to ask. In the missing data, more than 10% of the values of the variable has the missing data, then don't treat that as the missing data. Suppose whenever the missing data is having more than 10% of the total values of the variable, then you should compulsory you have to treat it as some data is missing. If the missing values are less than 10%, okay, so you can able to delete. How to do? Suppose substitute it with a neutral value, or you can able to substitute with the imputed value, right? Suppose the missing data is less than 10%. So at the time, what we have to do? So we have to substitute that missing data with the neutral value and imputed value. So imputation is the one where you can able to known as replacement values. So like K substitute, hot and cold like imputation, like this. So these are some of the replacement values, what we call it as an imputation. So the imputation by calculating the replacement values, right? So like mean substitution, regression, imputation. So based on the calculations, if you want to do, then you have to go for the mean substitution and regression imputation. Next one is data screening steps. So what are the data screening steps means? Check the abnormal data. So that means whether the data within out of range from the frequencies table, and go back to the original questionnaire and correct them, right? This is the way of steps what we are going to perform in data screening. Next one is data cleaning. So what are the steps that may be included in data cleaning? Will be identifying the missing data, normality, linearity, outliers, multi-collinearity, and homodidacticity. So these are the some of the methods or steps what we are going to perform in data cleaning itself. So identify the missing data, identify the normality, linearity, outliers, multicollinearity, and homodidacticity. So these are the things you have to be remembered in data cleaning. And next one is the describe about the different primary and secondary sources. So within this, so the data sources are going to be classified into two types. So first one is primary data source, and second one is secondary data source. This secondary data source still will be of two types, like internal records and external records. So like internal records means where the sales results, marketing activity, cost information, distributor reports, feedback, and customer feedback. So these are the things what we have going to be included in internal records. Again, these external sources will be of different types, like published data, standardized sources of marketing, and internet. So if I take published data, so that may be either an electronic mode or printed mode. So that should be carried out through governments and trade association, periodicals, newspapers, books, annual reports, and then private studies. Right. So then standardized sources of marketing like source audits, warehouse, withdrawal services, consumer purchase panels, and single source data, and then Nelson's television index, star stores, like this, and internet, right? So like this way you can able to collect the data from different sources. So the primary source means, so here the data is going to be obtained by investigator himself. You can able to treat it as a primary data, and this may also be considered as first-hand information. So the advantages with this is that the data what we gather should be precise one and reliable, and that but the disadvantage is that it should be a time consuming and expensive one, since the primary data is going to be obtained through direct professionals or direct personal oral health examination and questionnaire method. These are the ways we are able to obtain the primary data, right? So the primary source means here the data what we obtain by investigator himself will be considered as a primary data, and this is the first hand information. The advantages should be precise information, reliable, time consuming, and expensive also. The next question is the describe the different sources of data. So the different sources of data will be external and internal, what I said previously. So if I consider the external one, so the primary and the secondary data is there. So primary data means documents, creative works, interviews, man-made materials, and surveys. And secondary data is nothing but unpublished thesis, dissertations, manuscript, books, and journals. So these are the some of the examples of the secondary data. Right. So what is the published one? That is documents, creative works, interviews, man-made materials, and service. All this will be the example of primary data. And secondary data will be unpublished theses, dissertations, manuscript, books, journals. All this comes under secondary data. So if I consider internal and external sources of the data, so let me take internal sources of data. So many institutions and departments have information about their regular functions for their own and internal purposes. So when those information are going to be used in any survey, that should be called as internal source of the data. Example, social welfare society. If I consider external sources of data, so when the information is collected from outside agencies, it's called external source of the data. So such type of data may be either primary or secondary. This type of information can be collected by census and sampling method through by conducting surveys. So primary data, the data which is going to be collected from the field under the control and the supervision of an investigator. And primary data means where the original data has been collected specially for the purpose in mind. And this type of data is generally fresh and collected for the first time, and it should be useful for current studies as well as the future studies as well. For example, so you were questioning. So do another example of the primary data. So some of the primary research methods and techniques what we're going to consider here is, so what is the primary research we're conducting that should be classified in two types of data, like quantitative data and then qualitative data. Quantitative data means where that should be conducted to surveys like personal interviews, mails, and then in-house self-administration, telephone, email, web, and through experimentations in mechanical observation and then through simulation. If I'm going to consider the qualitative data, that should be gathered through focus groups or individual depth interviews and then human observation case studies. Like so, these are the some of this ways we can able to extract the quantitative data and the qualitative data. So quantitative data and qualitative data. So quantitative data means based on the numbers like 56% of any year old drinks alcohol at least 4 times a week does not tell you why, when, and how. That should be quantitative. Qualitative, more detail, so tells why you, why, when, and then how. That should be qualitative data. So these are the questions which may be answered. The data what is getting is qualitative data. Quantitative means based on the numbers. The primary research categories will be quantitative research. So it should be done through numerical way and statistical reliable and projectable to the world population. And some of the sampling methods also available. So random samples. So equal chance of anyone being picked, and then it may be select those not in target group. Sample sizes need not be large to be representative and can be very expensive. Stratified or segment random sampling. So here that should be based on the representative strata or segment and still not random but more focused, which may also be give more relevant information and maybe more cost effective also. And next one is the quota sampling. So here that should be done through segment, not randomly selected, and specific number on each segment are interviewed and may not be fully representative and then cheaper. Qualitative research. So here in-depth insight generating, non-numerical and directional will be the qualitative research. And some of the common techniques will be personal interviews, one-to-one, and then focus in groups or many groups like this. And some of the methods like observation method through personal observation, or the personal interview, or through the telephone interview, or through mail survey. So these are some of the methods where you can able to apply on primary data. Our next question is that describe the primary sources with merits and demerits. So the primary data is the one which is going to be collected by investigators from personal experimental studies. So for a specific research goal is called primary data. So the data what we collected, especially for the research project, should be considered as a primary data, and it is going to be used when the secondary data is unavailable and inappropriate, and the data that should be unique, original, reliable, and accurate in nature. The primary data has not been changed but should be altered by human beings. So with this its validity is greater than the secondary data. So the primary data merits and demerits will be, so the target issues are going to be addressed. That should be one of the merit, and data interpretation is better, and high accuracy of the data is another advantage, and which will also addresses the specific research issues and greater control. And demerits will be evaluated cost, time consuming, and then more number of resources are going to be required, and inaccurate feedback, and require a lot of skills with labor. So these are the some of the uh, disadvantages what we identify from the primary data, right? So evaluated cost, time consuming, and more number of resources that are required, inaccurate feedback, and require a lot of skill with the labor. So what are the techniques that are available for collecting the primary data? So first thing is that interview. So either that may be direct one and indirect one, and schedule, and based on the questionnaire survey, and then focus group discussion, and community forums and public hearings, observation, case studies, key information interview, internet, email, and SMS. These are some of the techniques that may be available for primary data collection. And next one is that describe the secondary sources with example. So here the secondary data is the data where the data is going to be collected and analyzed by some earlier agencies for its own use, for its own use, right? So later that same data is going to be used by different agency. That should be the example of secondary data. So this kind of data is going to be already collected, analyzed by some earlier agency. So this thing, the data which is going to be used by some other different agency should be considered as the secondary data. The sources of secondary data will be classified into types like published sources, example newsletter, and non-published sources like thesis. The data what is gathered or recorded by someone else prior to and for purpose other than the current project. The secondary data is the data which is going to be collected for another purpose, so it involves less cost, time, and effort. And the secondary data is the data that is going to be reused, usually in different contexts. Example, data from the book. And the sources will be internal and external sources. So the internal sources of the secondary data will be sales record, and then marketing activity, cost information, distributor reports and feedback, and then customer feedback. So these are some of the internal sources of the secondary data. And when it comes to external sources, these external sources will be journals, and then books, magazines, newspaper, libraries, and internet. So these are some of the external sources of the secondary data. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of the primary data? So for that, what I'm going to discuss is, so the advantages here, the target issues are going to be addressed, and the data interpretation is going to be better when compared to the secondary one, and efficient spending for information, dependency of the data, and then property issues, and then addresses specific information issues and greater control. So these are some of the advantages of the primary data. And disadvantage will be high cost, and then time consuming process, and inaccurate feedbacks, and more number of resources are required. Next, advantages and disadvantages of secondary data. So the advantages will be easy of access, low cost to acquire, and then clarification of research question, and then many answers to the research question. When it comes to disadvantages of the secondary data, quality of research not specific to research needs, incomplete information, are not timely. Next one is that compare and contrast between primary and secondary data. So if I'm going to take primary data. So the primary data what we collected should be real-time data, and it should be sure about the sources of the data, and it should also helps to give results and findings, costly and time-consuming process, and it should also avoid bias or response data and more flexible. And secondary data, if you into it, that should be past data, not sure about the sources of the data, refine the problem, cheap and no time consuming process, can't know and data biasing or not, and less flexible. So these are some of the differences what I identify between primary and then secondary data. So data processing is nothing but the data which is going to be after collecting the data, we have to be prepared for the data analysis. So for that, the collected data is raw actually, so it must be undergo some processing before analysis. So the result of analysis are going to be affected by a lot of form of data. So proper data processing must be reliable and the result, right? So the data processing should be done once the data is going to be collected from multiple sources, like primary or secondary. So the data should what we collected, everything should be in raw data. So what have to do? You have to send that data to some processing in order to get the reliable result. So for that, what are the objectives of the data processing will be? So checking the questionnaires and schedules, and reduction of mass data to manage the proportion, and then sum up of materials so as to prepare the tables, charts, graphs, and various groupings and breakdowns for presenting the results, and minimizing the errors which may be creep in at various stage of the survey. Right. So these are some of the objectives of the data processing. So checking the questionnaire and schedules, and then reduction of mass storage to manageable proportion, and then minimize the errors which may be creep in various storage of the survey. And what are the different types of data processing here? So first one is that manual data processing, so which involves in human intervention and implies many chances for errors such as delays in the data capture and high amount of operator misprints, and implies high labor expenses in regards to spending for equipment and supplies and rent. Right? So should be also one of the type of the data processing, manual data processing. So what are the important steps that are to be considered in data processing? So for that, the processing involves, so first thing is the questionnaire and checking is the very first step. So in order to extract the data, so that should be extraction done through questionnaire and checking. And then second step will be editing, and third step will be coding, right? So this is the first one, second and third. And next one will be the classification. So once the coding is done, then you have to go for the classification. So once the classification is done, then you have to go for the tabulation is the fifth step here. So once the tabulation is done, so you have to go for the graphical presentation is the sixth one, and apply data cleaning, and then apply data adjusting. Right. So these are the very important steps that may become in data processing. So data processing means the very first thing is the questionnaire and checking, and then editing, and then coding, and then classification, data adjusting, data cleaning, data representation, tabling. So all these are very important steps in the data processing. Thank you.
Like, share and subscribe. Hit the bell icon for more updates.